We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to another Reltio community show. My name is Chris Detzel, and today our show is going to focus on maximizing operational efficiency with Reltio's API for real-time MDM. We have special guest Mike Frasca. He's a field CTO here at Reltio, and he's actually been with Reltio for a really long time. He'll introduce himself here shortly, and he actually did a show probably when we first started the community shows a couple of years ago. So welcome back, Mike. So the rules of the show is the same stuff. Keep yourself on mute. Questions should be asked in chat. I will ask them as they come in. And if we get too many of them, we'll just kind of ask them at the end so that he can kind of finish up his presentation. The call, as usual, will be recorded and posted to the community. There is a survey at the end of the call. It's a Zoom pop-up. Please add your comments there, how the show went, and even your thoughts around future shows. Now, I'm only showing 3 shows. Now, I have 3 more coming out in June that I just haven't posted yet. Hopefully that will be up by the end of today. That is the goal. So the upcoming events as of today, today's show on maximizing operational efficiency, Mike Frasca. And tomorrow, I just like to do these back to back, I guess. Densifying entity data as a product, an introduction to data mesh and data as a product for customer data. There will be a demo with Anch. He's our senior VP of technology. Really excited about that. It's more of a thought leadership piece. And then on the 25th, we have Matt Gagan talking about, and I think he's actually on the show, real-time customer API with Reltio Integration Hub and MuleSoft. If you remember, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we did one on this, and there's a lot of changes to this piece, and it will be in depth, and I believe a demo as well. So I am really looking forward to today and these next 2 shows coming up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Mike, and let you kind of take over.
All right, give me 1 second. Let me get this shared.
Perfect.
Let me know when it, one sec. And Zoom just crashed.
That's never good.
Hopefully it still works. I have a big crash pop up, but
so far I see the presentation, so.
Yeah, I'm trying to page through it, and it might just be a little slow, but we'll make it through this.
Great.
So, hey everybody, I'm Mike Frasca. I am field CTO here at Reltio. I've been at Reltio since 2016, so going on about 7 years. My role at Reltio is basically to provide technical guidance to all of our field teams, our sales teams, our product teams, and then loop that experience back and customer feedback back into our engineering teams. And so I interface with pretty much everybody at Reltio and a lot of our customers. And so we can have a pretty in-depth technical discussion as we go through this. The goal here today is to talk through operational MDM and what that really means for customers using Reltio. Hopefully that'll tab over in a second.
That presentation with me, maybe I can go look at it real quick, and then what do you think?
Yeah, if you could try to bring that up, that would be great. Yeah, it looks like the screen is frozen. I'm trying to see if it's going to catch up.
Yeah, let me go find it real quick.
Apologies, guys.
Frasca. Did you want to stop sharing? Because I've got it up, I think. Perfect. And I'm almost there. Promised. Beauty about live shows, huh? All right.
Oh, it's much faster. can go back up one slide.
Okay. Oh, whoops.
Perfect. Well,
This one.
there you go. That one.
It's too fast. No. Okay, go ahead.
So I want to ground this in what's the business problems that we're solving here. MDM as a whole started out with a real focus on providing customer data to other applications, either operational applications to analytics environments. But we see more and more that customers are really leveraging Reltio and customer data to drive real world business problems in real time, handle omnichannel engagement, handle call center volume so they can do lookups for customer data into call centers, provide sales teams with real-time lookups into their contact information so they could reach out to people in the field without having to bring up a bunch of other applications, manage their privacy and consent preferences that they hook into their web portals to make sure that they're tracking certain cookies or storing certain preference and contact information. So as this trend is growing, we see more and more utilization of this customer data, of the organization data, of all of this master data in real time. And so today we're going to talk a lot about how you can leverage Reltio to hook into these operational systems to solve these real-time business problems. This has been a challenge, I think, that a lot of people have had in the MDM spaces. They have all this customer data, but it may be too slow or not fresh enough to get available to operational applications. Go to the next slide. So this is just an outline of how we see Reltio hooking into these other applications and other data sources. So on the left side, we have a lot of our applications or data sources bringing in data real time through our REST API. We have pre-configured connectors to Salesforce and using MuleSoft to bring in that enrichment data. We have a Reltio integration hub to allow you to connect to over 1,000 other applications and bring that data into Reltio as it's changing in those source applications. But on the outbound side, we've seen customers more and more connect directly to Reltio through our REST API to do lookups. This is primarily on a very read-centric approach, but do things like search for customers by phone number live, hook into mobile apps to connect to the REST API to identify a loyalty number as someone's walking in a store. And so the big thing that you'll notice in this diagram is that customers are doing this without the typical operational data store. So 10 years ago, when we wanted to do this kind of 10, 15 years ago, we wanted to do this, we would have our MDM tooling. We would bring in data, and we could bring in data pretty fast and pretty rapidly into our MDM environments. We would do all of our matching and merging. We would do some cleansing on the data. And then once a day, we'd have a big batch extract via ETL that would dump it into a relational operational data store. That operational data store would need to be maintained and serviced by your team. Then we need to build a service layer on top of that ODS, and then applications can connect to that service layer. And so at that point, you're getting data that's at least a day old. You have to maintain this other data storage environment and keep them in sync. You've got to build your own service layer on top of it. And that's very complex. With Reltio, we don't have that operational data store piece. So as soon as that data hits Reltio, it's available for query. It's available for gets to be put into those operational applications. And so I think it's a very big change in how we would typically see MDM tools being put into operational situations. Go to the next slide. And so this is really, in my mind, all about gets. It's all about reading data out of Reltio. Right? We have all this data in there, all this customer data. We're doing all of our organizing and cleansing of it. We're doing matching and standardization of it. We're associating relationships. We're remapping reference values. Like, we're doing all this really cool stuff. But until you can start getting that out and into your business applications, you're not really extracting all of the value that you could get out of it. So I mentioned customers doing things like connecting their IVR phone systems and hooking them into Reltio. So imagine the case that I go onto a website and I'm searching for help for something. I'm not sure about a product. I want to return a product, or if I'm having a problem with a product. I have a login profile that I signed in online. It has my order history. And I call your customer service line. If that data is flowing into Reltio, now I can do a direct lookup with that phone number on that IVR system, and I can get person's information. I can see all their whole order history. I can see their relationships. I can see all the enriched information about them. If they're a supplier or a vendor, I can get their DUNS number. I can see their whole corporate hierarchy. And I can use that for call routing live, so that by the time I get a person on the phone, a few seconds later, I have all this information about them and I can solve their problem for them immediately. And that's a very powerful thing. And it's all done with gets, right? It's all done with just pulling data, searching data, and making that available fast to these applications. So as we go through this, we're going to talk about some very specific APIs that customers are utilizing in order to make this paradigm possible. We're going to talk about ID-based lookups. We're going to talk about searches, which are more exploratory in nature. We're going to talk about synchronous matching, which is really about, what if I loaded this into Reltio tenant, what would it actually match with? And we're going to talk about a cool new capability, which is coming out in our newest release in our next 23.2 release, which is going to talk about multi-entity retrieval and multi-relationship retrieval with a single call. And I think this will be extremely powerful for a lot of our customers that are leveraging concepts like reference attributes in order to get data out of the platform. We're going to talk about a little bit about when to use them, why they're important, what the benefit is, and then I'm going to walk through some actual stats from customers so you can see what some customers are doing with the platform today. And hop to the next slide. So as I was preparing for this presentation, I was walking through and I was looking at different APIs, and I was talking through, how should you use them and what's the benefit of them. And I, as I was putting together, I rapidly thought there's immediately going to be a question that says, what are customers getting for a response rate with these APIs? And I already see that question in the chat, right? We haven't even, that's the very first question that was asked. Like, this is on everybody's mind. What am I actually going to see when I do this stuff? These are 3 customers, live customers. I pulled a single day of transactions the week of May 1st, and I just grabbed that week because I did this last week, and so I grabbed the last week of data. I didn't spend a whole lot of time searching for different weeks or different days. I just grabbed the largest amount of updates I could find the week of 5/1, and wanted to put them onto the to showcase what some other customers are seeing. So customer 1 has about 55 million total entities or objects inside of their Reltio tenant. They are doing, on this day, they did a little over 1 million updates. Their average update time frame was 283 milliseconds. So that when we start getting into real-time performance, we want to shift from thinking about averages to thinking about P90 and P95 numbers. And so what this means is that 90 or 95% of the transactions completed in less than that time. So a P95 means that 95% of the transactions on this day of these update transactions completed in less than 373 milliseconds. Then we talk about the underlying piece. That's just on updates, right? These are just adding stuff into the tenant. So it's still got to cleanse it and enrich it and things like that. But where we really get into the value here is on the retrieval side, right? And so this is a new API that I'm going to talk a little bit about later called Search Connections. It allows you to do multi-entity lookups inside of the Reltio tenant. This customer did 1.1 million lookups on this day. 95% of them completed in less than 158 milliseconds. That speed of those transactions allows them to hook this into operational systems. And so on average, I would say most of our customers are looking at somewhere around less than 400 milliseconds P95 in order to hook these into operational applications. You can see here, this customer is significantly lower than that. Some of this is based on the data that they're looking up, right? Certain transactions, if they're doing a search and it returns 50 objects, it's going to be slightly longer than if they do a search and it returns 1 object. But these are real world examples, right? This is their production environment. I didn't massage any of these numbers. I just grabbed them for the last week to show you guys. Customer number 2 has 63 million objects inside of their Reltio tenant. They're doing a little over 1 million updates on this day. Their P95 is 508 milliseconds. This customer does some of their updates in real time and some of them in batch. And so those batch updates actually cluster objects together in a single call. So of these million updates, roughly about 30% of them have more than one entity inside of that update. And so it'll take a little bit longer for those to process, but we're still seeing really great response times on those ads. But then we get to the retrieval, which is what we say. This is where that customer experience comes in, is on getting the data back out and into those applications. On this same day as they did those million updates, they did 653,000 searches. So these are search requests with filters, things like looking up by phone number or by first name or by address. And their P95 was 256 milliseconds. So, this is hooked into their website. And so as you log into their website, it does a full lookup into Reltio, finds profiles, and displays that information. And then customer number 3, this customer is all batch on the data loads. And so the data load transaction rates are a little bit different here. But I wanted to highlight some of their search APIs. They have 1.1 billion records in their tenant. And so searches come across all of those. They are processing on this day about 1.6 million search transactions with a P95 of 367 milliseconds. And so the important thing that I wanted to kind of highlight here is that we have customers that are doing this today. They are hooking these into their operational applications. You no longer need to build complex ETL streams with ODSs in order to support this. You can provide significant value to your business customers by making this customer data, the supplier data, this vendor data available as a data product for your organization. We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow on the data products call. But this is something that's very powerful. And I think a lot of times when we start on that MDM journey, we tend to focus on things like analytical use cases, and we stay away from operational cases, or we look at bringing this data into that ODS, and it adds a lot of complexity to our our projects that we could remove by just making direct calls into the Reltio platform. And so there is a question in the chat that I'll just take really quickly. Was what does P90 and P95 mean? So P90 is a 90th percentile. And so that means that 90% of the transactions that happened on this day completed in less than that time. So 90% on the customer 3, 90% of the search transactions that they ran on this day completed in less than 253 milliseconds, and 95% of the transactions they executed on this day completed in less than 367 milliseconds. The reason we want to move and shift as we look into operational MDM into metrics like P90, P95, P99 is that it more accurately reflects the customer experience on your tenant. If you use things like averages and you have a transaction that gets hung up somewhere, and that transaction takes, gets left open for 2 minutes, or for whatever the case, we don't time that transaction out, it will dramatically impact the average. But if that's one transaction out of 1 million, it's probably not a major impact on your customer experience. But on the other flip side of that, if I have thousands of transactions that are just slightly over our SLA, our average will look really good, right? The average of, if I have 2 transactions, one's 1 second and one is 10 seconds, right? Our average is right around 5 seconds, a little over 5 seconds. That average may be okay in that case, but then if you look at the P90 and say that 50% of our transactions went way long, that gives you a much more accurate view into what's actually happening in your tenant and what your customers are experiencing using the platform. And so that's really I think a paradigm shift from those average and median numbers when we do metrics and start tracking against these things. And hop to the next slide. So we're kind of zooming through this, through these pieces, but we're going to take some time and walk through some of these APIs that customers are using in order to achieve these response rates. The way we're going to walk through is basically kind of a flow chart. If you can use this first one, you should use this first API. can't use an ID-based lookup, we'll go to the next API and so on and so on. So anytime you can use an ID-based lookup in order to get data for your operational applications, you want to use an ID-based lookup. So what does that mean? Because there's lots of IDs, a pretty loaded term, and there's lots of IDs that we're storing in the tenant. An ID-based lookup is a lookup via the Reltio ID, which is a new concept we have in Reltio. Sometime in mid last year, our entity ID or a crosswalk ID. So it does not include customer-defined IDs that are in the tenant. We'll talk a little bit how you can use them to do lookups, but these are very specific identifiers, typically the entity ID or the crosswalk ID. The reason this API is recommended to be leveraged is that it's fast. It bypasses our search index and it goes directly against our primary data store to get this data. So you save time on this request by not having to do an index-based lookup. And so from a technical perspective, we're cutting out part of that transaction, which means we can respond really, really rapidly for you. You can use
any one of them?
Any one of these. And
Okay.
so you can use the Reltio ID, you can use the entity ID, or you can use the crosswalk ID. Any of those IDs will have essentially the same performance values on the retrieval using this API. So to kind of try to add some highlights to this, that this only applies to IDs that are stored as crosswalk IDs or entity IDs. Identifiers that are stored as attributes in the tenant don't follow this pattern. They follow a search pattern. And so that's going to be on a future slide. These are the most performant requests in the platform. And so always, 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 whenever we can use these IDs, we want to use those IDs for lookup.
Around what the crosswalk ID is.
Sure. So crosswalk ID is a source-defined identifier for a record. And so let's say I have a record in Salesforce for Mike Frasca as a contact, and I load that record into Reltio. Salesforce has an identifier that it uses to identify that contact record. We persist that same ID inside of Reltio, and then we also apply an entity ID on top of it. So we say this is the Reltio ID for that same object. A given entity in Reltio, so a given person or a profile in Reltio, can have multiple crosswalk IDs, but will have one and only one entity ID. And so the reason crosswalk IDs are valuable is if you have a system that is contributing a record into the Reltio tenant, typically they already have an identifier for that person. They know what they call it locally inside of their application. And so you can use that identifier to do the lookup in order to retrieve the Reltio version of that object, which then takes the whole golden record back and returns it back to you. So your entry point can be the ID that you have, but your response will be the full golden record for that object. And it is the source key for that object.
Thank you. And one other question: how would Reltio minimize the replication latencies from write to read replicas?
So we would typically recommend that you don't have a separate read replica. So that's kind of that ODS paradigm. Inside of Reltio, when you make a post and you add a new record to Reltio, it is immediately available via this ID, via this entity ID and crosswalk ID. It is aligned and stored synchronously with your post. And so there is no replication of data. There is no indexing of data. It is available instantly. As soon as you get back that success response, you can make a call back and get that object with either the crosswalk ID that you submitted or the entity ID that gets associated with it.
All right. One last question, and then we'll keep going. So what's the average replication latency timing?
So there is no replication latency as part of this. As soon as that synchronous update is responded to successfully, you can make this call instantly. Right. There is no latency at all. So that's part of the reason why this API is so good. It's so valuable because you can immediately get that data everywhere you want if you have the identifier for it. And so as we publish out to our SQS message queues, you can get that data. as an application loads a record, it can immediately get that record right back and say, give me the golden version of this object back. It's available for use right away. Great. Go to the next slide. So let's say you don't have an ID, right? You're a downstream application, or you're a website or a mobile app, and you're not contributing data, so you don't know this person yet, and you want to do a lookup and say, do I know this person across my enterprise? So this is more of an exploratory request. It's, I have an address, or I have a phone number, or I may have an NPI number for a doctor, or I may have an SSN for a patient. You have a loyalty number for a customer, but those aren't identifiers. So we use another API called a get with filter. So anytime you're doing a get entity API call and you have a filter in the parameters piece, it's doing this search. What that means is that it is hitting our search index to identify the object and then retrieving those objects and sending them back to you. It's still a synchronous request. It's still a highly performant request, but it has a little more overhead than the previous request because I now have to look at that search index. So they'll have a little more latency as part of the request. Also, the amount of objects that get returned will highly impact the latency of that request. If I do a search on Mike Frasca in North Carolina and I have my zip code, ideally that thing is probably going to return one object back in your tenant, right? There's probably very few Mike Frascas that live in my zip code. But if I do a search that says customer in North Carolina, probably have a lot of people that get returned with that search. And so the response payload will be larger, which means the latency will be higher. And so your latency on searches will be very tied to the data set that you have in the tenant. As you are using this into operational applications, we want these queries to be as crisp and as explicit as possible in order to limit the payload of the objects that are coming back for that operational application to process through. So a few things about this API that are a little bit different than the API before. Right? You don't have an ID, so you can't use an identifier. You have any attribute. This search works on literally every attribute you have in your tenant. You do not have to define attributes in Reltio as searchable. Every attribute is searchable. Every attribute gets indexed. Every attribute can be used as part of this API in order to request data back. That's, to me, incredibly powerful. I remember in working with previous products where I had to go define database indexes for searches, and I had to go sit down with a customer and go, tell me every way you'd ever want to look up data. And we had to write all this stuff down. And then inevitably, when they added a new attribute, we'd have to go ask all of their customers and constituents, do you want to use this for lookups? And if so, now we need to go add an index in here. We need to go add in a piece into our service layer. We need to go, add this into our ETL to move this into our ODS. It becomes very complicated in order to add new lookup queries or new lookup capabilities into typical legacy MDM platforms. Reltio, you don't do that. You don't have to worry about that at all. Every single attribute is searchable. So go nuts with search. But as you're leveraging this API, there are a few things to think about here. Indexing, the first big thing is indexing is asynchronous to the data load. So what that means is that when you update a record or you add a record into Reltio, we do automatically index that object. But when you get back that success response on the post, the indexing hasn't been completed yet. That indexing is a separate process that runs asynchronously to your request. It is very fast. It should happen in seconds, not minutes or hours, in order to make that data available, but it is not immediate. And so there is some delay in making this available. Now, the delay is significantly less than if we talk about once a day ETL movement into an ODS where we have to go through that process. We're still talking seconds here, but it's something to be cognizant of as you're designing searches and designing these integration patterns. And then the second piece is that API and the latency of these APIs will be very dependent on the search criteria that you have. If I search for Mike Frasca in my zip code, I'm probably only going to get one response. And so that will be very fast. But if I said, give me back everybody I have in my tenant in North Carolina, and I happen to have 80% of the population of North Carolina in my tenants, that response is going to be significantly slower because there's a lot more payload to respond back with. And so as you're utilizing these for applications, for operational applications, be very explicit as you're leveraging those.
Well, in the next release, is that what you're saying, Mike? Earlier?
This is available right now. So today,
Oh, okay.
These two APIs, there's only one API on here, which will be the last one that I talk
Okay.
about. That will be new in the newest release. And I think everybody on here will be very excited about it, and there'll be lots of questions about it because I am very excited about it. It is something that I have been, pushing for internally for a long time, and I think will provide a lot of value to our customers and partners.
And is there API documentation on this? I saw that Matt posted an entity search doc, but is there specific documentation generated to made available for consumption based on our data model or their data model?
So there is documentation both on our docs portal as well as our Swagger docs. And so if you're on the more technical side, there's some Swagger docs around this API. What I can do is I can work with Chris to basically highlight the Swagger docs and the doc portal link for each of these APIs and get that posted on the community after this call. So it's very explicit and you don't have to go find it yourself.
And if you put that in the PowerPoint that you have here, just maybe another slide, that would be helpful.
Sure.
And then I know Matt kind of answered this, but Matt wanted you to explain a little bit more. The question is, I know about the entity ID and the crosswalk ID. What is a Reltio ID?
So Reltio ID is a new concept that came out about a year ago. It is the ability to persist a generated ID as essentially as a crosswalk identifier. We are looking at shifting our entity ID in order to support a more unique identifier across the platform. So Reltio ID is the umbrella concept of making an identifier that is not just unique within a tenant, but unique across the entire platform. We have customers that are very interested in, or that have multiple tenants for different geographies. And we want to uniquely identify people within those geographies, but we may want a global identifier that sits across all of them, across those geographies. So we want to share data between tenants, or we want to be able to do lookups across multiple tenants. And so Reltio ID is concept that we just started last year, but we'll have more and more releases flushing that and making that, expanding that capability, really to support multi-tenant lookup and multi-tenant search and uniqueness across tenants.
Thank you. That was good. And so for Search API, are we returning large data sets in buckets of pages? Why do we say that the latency would be high if we search for all tenants in the NC?
So it's the payload of the object that gets returned. So if I do a search for Mike Frasca in my zip code, and I get one response, one thing that gets returned with that search, the JSON payload, the text of it, is only going to be a certain size. But if I search for all of North Carolina, and I have, let's say, 20,000 things get returned, I have 20,000 lines now. And so returning one line is going to be smaller. It'll be literally just a smaller size and storage size than 20,000 lines. It'll just be more stuff that I have to send out over that response rate. And so because there's more stuff there, it takes longer for it to go over the internet. Right? We have a certain amount of data. That data size impacts the latency of the response.
Okay. Couple more questions. What's the typical latency delay for the record to be available for search once after it's posted in Reltio?
I'd say this is typically happening in about a second or 2 seconds. Sometimes that can be slightly higher. Sometimes that can be lower, but roughly a few seconds, it should be available for search after the initial post.
And just a quick comment, global ID across tenants is a great idea. Would love to learn more on this. So would the new Reltio IDs be like the GUIDs or ULIDs or something else? And how would it impact the use or entity ID at present, please?
So we are looking, this is still pretty forward looking, right? So we're getting a little bit into some conjecture. Right? Some of this may change as we flush these things out. We are looking specifically at UUIDs to support this across tenants. And we have not fully flushed out how it will tie in with the entity ID concept today. But our focus is making sure that there's no impact to any operational or API usage today on the tenant that's leveraging that entity ID. And so we're looking at either sourcing this in parallel or looking at ideas for how we can make this available as part of the entity ID. So there's a few different kind of tacks we're looking at internally around that, but really the focus is, one, don't impact customers, right? We don't want to impact you and the stuff that you're doing today. We want you to do all the cool stuff that you're doing today and keep doing that easily without having to change anything. And two, we want to really start looking at how we can start exposing capabilities around true uniqueness across tenants. So you can do stuff like multi-tenant lookups.
Right. And
which
let's
I think
get to
unlock a lot of really cool ideas and cool concepts.
Yeah. And so to get to the good stuff, one more question, and because there'll be a lot of questions probably on the next one. Is pagination supported with search?
It is supported with search, and so you can paginate those search responses in order to speed up the query on them.
Okay, great. And thanks to Matt for answering a bunch of questions. All right, let's keep going.
Okay, let's hop on to the next slide. So we have one more slide though about things that are available today that you can use right now. And so this is synchronous matching. Let's say you don't have an ID to look up. Search is too exploratory, so it's too big, too broad. You want to use your match rules and the matching engine to say, what if I loaded this record? What would you match with? We have a synchronous matching API. This is something that a lot of our customers don't leverage today, which I think could be really powerful in operational applications. It said this is really a what if API. It's, if I loaded this, what would the match rules do? What would you associate with? Would you make this a potential match? Would you make this, would you automatically merge it with something that already exists? So it's not really an exploratory thing like searches. It's very, very targeted. And so it should be limited to when systems need to do really tight non-ID based lookups to identify if the platform knows an entity. This is not a low latency request. It takes additional overhead in order to respond to this because it has to go through the full matching engine. So it goes through your full match rules and responds back the output of the matching process. So it is inherently slower than search, which is inherently slower than ID-based lookups. But it is still really valuable for you to use within operational systems, especially if you have systems that may not have those 400 millisecond response times, but you may be okay with a 1 or 2 second response time. These APIs can be really, really valuable. To highlight, for highlights on this one, this is not a search request. This is explicitly to identify matches to objects that are in a tenant. So it's a very, very narrow scope. It's not exploratory, not kind of broad lookups. It does not use the search index, but it does go through the matching engine. And so it does add additional latency as you process this. We take the object that you send in, we tokenize it, we compare it against all the different things we want to compare it against from the tenant, and we run through the full matching process just as if you loaded it. Your match rules will have a significant impact on the performance of this API. If you have 2 match rules, it should be significantly faster than if you have 40 match rules for this request. And so this request is really dependent on your tenant. If you want to start leveraging these APIs for lower latency response times, you can submit the match rule you want to compare it against as part of that payload in order to limit the scope of the comparison in order to make these things perform faster. It will return back every object that is true for 1 or more match rules in the response. So you don't wait for a file. This is synchronous still, so you still get a response back on the request call, but it'll be slower than the previous 2 requests. Now, this is still really useful for operational applications. So this is not something that takes 2 minutes to run. It's still a second or 2 for this to execute in most cases for customers, but it's not that 400 millisecond response time. So you can actually process this as a question about, do we have to set match rules to internal or external for this to work? If it's internal, it will not process on this. If it's external, it will. You can set it to both. You can also specify the match rule as a payload inside of the request and just use that match rule to compare this against. And so you can be very explicit with the scope when leveraging this API.
So we have a question from a previous slide, but is there a way to search for entity based on attribute combination with the contributed source system? So meaning I need to get a entity. If entity has attribute, that must be contributed by specified source system in the filter. If that makes sense, but
I think I understand what the question is.
okay.
I would have to look at the API documentation myself. I would say that I am not as fluent on very specific filter requests.
Yeah.
And so certainly we can get you a very explicit answer for that. I just wouldn't know off the top of my head. I would look at the Swagger docs in order to tell that.
Great. Thanks for answering that one question about external match rules. And can you can it be possible to have data validation API just like the other APIs?
So data validation APIs are executed essentially as what we call lifecycle actions as they run through the tenant. I'm not sure if they can be exposed off the top of my head. I can certainly ask about that though, and get you an answer on it.
All right. And how is this? Everybody's posting stuff in there, and so it's moving my thing. How is this different than external match?
So I would look at external match as an asynchronous process. So typically when we think about external match, it is we have a file and we send the file of a bunch of records into the tenant and say, what would I match these with? And then I get an output accordingly. This is very explicit. So it's typically like one at a time. Effectively, it's doing the same thing. Effectively, it's still going through and doing the matching engine on the data in order to respond back with whatever matches to it. This is synchronous versus a big file load. And so these requests would be one-off individual requests versus I have a whole file from a new source system that I want to kind of bump up against my tenant. But effectively, they operate in identical ways.
Cool. And I think this might have been answered in my short. Can we use synchronous matching API for external match? I think that's a yes.
So yes, as I said, essentially they operate very similarly. They still go through the matching engine. It's a different kind of entry point into that versus it's a synchronous request versus an asynchronous file-based request.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hey Chris, it's Dmitry. I can answer the previous question on search real quick. We do not support use cases where the request would be like, find me entities where this attribute comes from this source only or this specific source. We don't support filters like that today. We support filters find me entities which has certain sources, but we don't have. You cannot build a query where you can say, the attribute value comes from this source only, something like that. If that was a question, as I understand it, that's not supported today.
All right, thanks, Dmitry.
All right, let's hop to the next slide.
This is the exciting one. Here we go.
So this is a kind of an eye chart. There's a lot of text on here. And luckily Dmitry is on the call because Dmitry is really driving this. This is something that is coming. It is not available today, but it is very exciting. And so I wanted to talk about it as part of these requests. This is called search connections. What this does is it allows me to search for a single entity and return not only that entity, but the relationships for that entity and the entities on the other side of those relationships. So let's think about a kind of a real world example. I am an insurance carrier and I have a bunch of people that are my customers and they have a bunch of policies. I want to do a lookup because I have a policy ID and that's my entry point. And I get that on the phone, on a phone number for a call center application. And I do a lookup on that policy. With this request, I can not only get all the policy details, but I can get all the people associated with that policy in one request. let's say I'm a customer for a retailer, and I am storing customer data and household data in Reltio. And I want to be able to do a lookup to see when a customer walks in the store and I'm going to buy something. I do a lookup for a phone number. I use this API and I get back Mike Frasca. And I also get back my household, and I get back my wife, Nicole, as part of that response. So I can get all of her information too. This becomes incredibly powerful when you want to query one entity based on data in another entity. And so today, we have a lot of customers that do this via a concept we call reference attributes. It allows you to essentially persist data from one entity in another entity. Reference attributes add to the size of objects and may not be as performant in some examples. This API allows you to meet that search request of searching for one entity by looking at another without having to use those reference attributes. It can crawl across essentially different types of relationships and return things at both sides. This API is scheduled for 23.2, which is our summer release. And so it'll be generally available at that point. The entry point to this API can be either an ID-based lookup, like we talked about before, or a search. And so the same caveats apply that we talked about before. If you have an ID, a crosswalk ID or an entity ID, in order to use that as your entry point, you should use that as part of this API. It will be faster. It will bypass the search index and will make things retrieve faster from the platform. If you don't have that, that's fine. You can use a regular search, and you can use any attribute on a profile to do that search. And as part of your request, you define the relationship type you want to use for it to crawl across the graph with, and it will go return the search results. It'll return the relationship and return the things on the other side of that relationship. This, to me, is incredibly exciting because it allows us to take more benefit and more value out of the graph and all of the different connections we have inside of the Reltio tenant today. So I'm going to pause there. So I am assuming there will be some questions about this. And I said, luckily we have Dimitri on the phone, who is our product manager, who's really driving this, and this is his brainchild. So
just quickly, the availability is going to be this summer, and June 5th is the release of.
That's early access, and
early access.
J is 27th. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so it's late June is when it's available to everyone.
Yep.
So Chandra says, this is good addition. Relationship-based UI search will get improved as well, right?
So this is specifically tied in with just API. There's no changes to our UI as part of this.
Okay.
We have an API first mentality for everything we do, which means that we always release all of these capabilities as an exposable API first, and then we look at how we can incorporate that into the UI. We do this because we want to make sure that you can connect and use these APIs in your applications first, and then our UI should use the same APIs that your applications use. We don't want to have some unique Reltio specific, separate secret APIs that we're leveraging. So this is the start of this, which will be API functionality, and then we are looking at how we can leverage these APIs in order to improve UIs in future releases.
How is this different than the Connections API?
So the Connections API today returns the relationships for an entity. I can give you an entity and I can say, give me back all of the relationships on it, and it will show me the start and end objects on those relationships. But let's take an example of that policy example, right, from an insurance carrier. If I have a policy ID and I wanted to see the data about that policy, right, all the information I'm storing about that, because I have that as an entity in Reltio, and I want to see everybody related to that policy, all of the customer information about them. Before this API, the way I would do that is I would make a get call by ID into the policy entity, and I would get a response. Then I would make a get connections call with that ID, and I would get back all of the relationship off of that entity. And then I would do another series of get calls for every entity on the other side of those relationships, one per relationship. I would make a call. And so there's multiple calls that get made here. And the latency for having to make that go back and forth between the platforms adds a lot of chattiness. This call makes all of that happen in one call, one API, and get that returned. And if you can scroll back up to that stat slide for me.
Yeah, just a sec.
This customer on the left is using this API today. 1.1 million of these calls, of the search connections calls in a single day, while they were doing 1 million updates on a tenant that has 55 million objects in it. Their P95 response time on that search connections API is 158 milliseconds. This can be incredibly powerful in our operational applications. They did not have to, in order to make this available, this connections API, they don't have to have a large ETL layer that they now need to support. They don't need to have a whole other service layer they've got to build out from scratch on a big service bus somewhere. They don't have to build out a relational ODS in order to store this data and have data architects design that and manage that. Okay? They can just make a direct call into Reltio to do this.
Sweet. So there was two questions about the connections API. So hopefully Suvam and Zafar, that answers that question. Really good. Dhruv mentions this could remove the 10K tree view on the UI. If you want to respond to that, but
so we have a limit of 10,000 relationships that we display in the UI today. Primarily, we have that in place because after you get around 10,000, a list of more than 10,000 objects in the UI, it's pretty hard to make sense of that as a person looking at that and kind of paging through that. We're hoping that more search capability around these things will allow us and allow our customers and partners to make those results that smaller so you can really find what you're looking for versus trying to read through 11,000 or 20,000 lines on a website.
That makes sense. Will this include the relationships of the related entities as well, or only direct relationships?
So it is a one-hop API. So today, where we make a call for an entity, you specify a relationship that you want to connect from that object off of, and it will grab the other side of that relationship as well.
Since we could use a filter on the tree ownership, I'm not really sure what that's trying to say, but next question. In a typical relationship DB setting, it calls one-to-many or many-to-many relationships. Is this similar to it?
I'm not sure I fully understand the concept of relationships in Reltio are always defaulted to supporting many-to-many off of objects. So you can have many different relationship types between two different entities, but there'll be one instance of a specific type between two specific entities. And so I can have a policy that can have n number of relationships off of that policy, one relationship per person that's listed on that policy, which is kind of like the example we've been talking through. And then or a person could have n number of policies off of them, or I belong to 2 households, or I have 15 products that are related to a person, or I have 17 vendors that roll up into a corporate hierarchy. You can have any number of relationships that tie in between entities. And what this API does is it crawls across them for you automatically without you having to make multiple API calls to do that.
Well, that was really good. Any other questions? There was a ton of questions around this, and I think there's lots of really good clarity, and it looks like this new API is going to be really cool, and that's coming out really soon, by late June. Early access is early June, so we will have a call on our release very soon. So, by the way, any ideas on when the documentation will be available, Mike or Dimitri?
There'll be released with the rest of
Same.
the major
So
release
June.
documentation.
Yeah, same time. And one question, can you comment on the response above about a customer specific ID generator and when that might be coming?
So today we have ID generators that you can define in your tenant, and you can persist them both as an attribute and as a crosswalk value. Those IDs can support UUIDs, and they can support sequence generated IDs. In order for you to persist that on objects, they happen automatically as you load data into the Reltio platform. And you can also make direct calls to them via an API to get the next sequence in a sequence generator.
Great.
And that's available today in the platform.
Yeah, and then it looks like Matt pushed, well, never mind. He's responding to something else. Well, thanks everyone for your time today. Hopefully this was helpful. Please take the survey when Zoom pops up. All of this is helpful to all your, feedback is helpful. Mike, Dimitri, Matt, thank you so much for answering questions, the presentation, and we're looking forward to this API and thank you for the clarity on the other APIs. So more to come, everyone. Thank you again. This will be posted hopefully tomorrow to the community, and the presentation will be also available. I'll make sure that it's put in there, and then I'll send it out through email to everyone on this call as well. So thank you, everyone.
Just one last thing, Chris, before you drop.
Yeah.
I would encourage everybody, especially if you're starting to look at operational use cases in MDM, please share some stories about what your thoughts are on the community. I would love to understand a little more about how you all are looking at leveraging this capability across your enterprise, because I think this can be incredibly powerful. And the more really smart people we put on this to understand it, I think the better. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions that you might have, go to community.reltio.com. I'll make sure that Mike, Dimitri, and Matt help answer these questions specifically around the API. Again, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the time and effort, and hopefully see some of you tomorrow. Take care.